Aatrox's rework is one of the most heavily documented and discussed visual gameplay updates in League of Legends history. A champion who was once among the least played of all time, pulling a 180, and is now among the most played of all time. Yet the way he got there was very divisive, the community being torn between those who embraced who he is now and those who wish he stayed as is. Empirically speaking though, his overhaul was an objective accomplishment. Whether you're of the school of thought that his rework was an injustice on his previous identity or not, that much can't be denied. This is a very successful champion. Ever since 2018, he's been a hallmark top laner, easily hovering around a 10 to 15% pick rate throughout the better part of Season 12. His year-long dominance culminated into the best top lane performance at the Season 12 World Championship, where Kingin showcased just how destructive he could be in the right hands. Yet even with his massive presence, his reputation is unusually a lot healthier than that of other high-profile picks. With that said, I thought it would be fitting for the next episode of the series to feature him, so how about we go over why everyone plays Aatrox. Having made a rework retrospective on him last year, I started out like others, dejected by his VGU, but on a very personal level. Aatrox was the first champion I ever mained, and his previous iteration holds a special nostalgia in my heart. So, despite agreeing that he was a very poorly designed champion, I was sad to see him go. Part of me wishes he was still around today and the reworked Aatrox was a different champion, but over time, I did grow to appreciate what he's become. Present-day Aatrox is the raid boss to end all raid bosses, a juggernaut that really hammers home the feeling of 1v9ing teams if played correctly. See, top lane is home to the most class diversity out of any lane period. We have divers, juggernauts, assassins, mages of all three kinds, marksmen, skirmishers, enchanters, vanguards, wardens. Even so, the fighter class holds a considerable market share, especially juggernauts, well known for the simplistic yet powerful gameplay, being easy and rewarding to play. But an everyday source of frustration for them is how vulnerable they are to getting counterpicked. Their short range and lack of mobility makes them frequent victims of cheese top laners, making them vastly more dangerous to blind pick than just about any other class. Something Aatrox is blessed with that few other melee champions can say they have, especially fighters, is a neutral game. While not a term used very often outside of fighting games, every competitive game heavily emphasizes the importance of neutral, even more so at higher levels of play, and is the single biggest reason why everyone plays them. For the uninitiated, neutral denotes a phase during gameplay where neither player has a situational advantage over the other, and both are trying to probe for opportunities to gain that advantage. You tend to see this more often during the mid to late game when both teams are pacing back and forth, trying to throw out whatever pressure they can without exposing themselves in return. This usually happens when contesting objectives like Dragon or Baron. But neutral happens very often in lane 2, where both champions are simply farming creeps and managing the wave, occasionally throwing some poke damage or threatening a trade. A champion is a very strong neutral game if they're able to exert pressure on their opponent effectively without them being able to do the same back. Artillery mages like Xerath, Vel'Koz, and Ziggs are prime examples of champions with a strong neutral game thanks to their long-range poke. Ranged auto-attackers like marksmen have inherently better neutral games on account of their ability to damage melees without being struck back. Disregarding mobility. Despite being a melee champion and part of the Juggernaut archetype, Aatrox is a very strong neutral game, having a safer and more comfortable laning phase due to many factors, effective range being the most notable one. Darkenblade's first cast has a target range of 625 units with a sweet spot at the farthest edge, dealing 144 base plus 128% of its AD in damage. Obviously, it is the weakest of the 3 strikes, but that's still not too shabby. At a max rank, it has a 6-second cooldown, relatively spammable. If he so chooses, Aatrox can also use the second cast, which is a target range of roughly 500 if you angle it correctly. That's still far enough to attack most other top laners without having to get up close. Aatrox can further extend his range through Umbral Dash, adding up to 300 more units if he approaches with it for 925. Far enough to reach even the likes of more pokier top laners like Jace, Gangplank, and Kennen. Alternatively, he can retreat with it to extend his range defensively, damaging the enemy top laner while creating space between him and them. Thanks to this, Aatrox doesn't have to commit to a short burst trade or all-in fight to pressure his opponent. He can repeatedly chip away at them, and as I'm sure my fellow top laners can all relate to, there's nothing more tilting than being harassed in lane. So what often happens is, the enemy laner will run out of patience and eventually charge headfirst into an all-in fight, putting them in a vulnerable position as Aatrox is one of the best punishers in the game. Since he's still classified as a melee champion, he has the base stats of a melee champion, making him just as hard to take down as other juggernauts. If you carelessly approach him, especially while low on health, he can set up infernal chains and use his Qs to prevent you from escaping. Champions who blow their dashes too early like Pantheon or Renekton will have no escape, and once they burn their cooldowns, you're free to hack away at them as you please. Additionally, it's not like Aatrox is a bad all-in either. If he sweet spots every Q, you're staring down some of the highest base damage in the entire game. Trying to whittle away at its HP won't be that easy either because of the other part of his neutral game. He's a manaless champion with zero cost abilities. Furthermore, he's a drain tanker. Umbral Dash is a passive that lets him heal for a portion of all damage dealt to champions. Considering he's able to safely damage the enemy laner at minimal risk of counterattack, he can sustain himself quite easily. He also historically builds a moderate amount of battle healing items like Gore Drinker, Eclipse, and lately in preseason he's been running the new Ravenous Hydra, further compounding his endurance in the early to mid game. Aatrox's strong neutral makes him a very safe blind pick in a lane where such options are few and far between, even though it's the role with the highest likelihood of getting matchup screwed. So many champions hard counter others here, as in no matter how good you are, if the enemy laner counterpicks you and is reasonably competent at the champion, you have zero chance of winning without jungle intervention. One would think ranged champions are exempt from this, but that's not true. There's practically no safe champion to blind pick up top with how extensive the champion pool is, but Aatrox comes very close to being one of those safe picks, having just the right tools to survive and thrive. Most ranged top laners face one or two weaknesses. They either have no sustain or a terrible disadvantage state, meaning once they're engaged on, they're basically screwed. Kennen, Jace, Gnar, Teemo, Quinn, provided they don't build sustain items, any damage you deal to them is permanent. So if you're patient enough, you can outlast them. Vladimir and Cassiopeia do have sustain, but if you engage on them at the right time and place, most melee champions outdamage them in all-in fights. Aatrox's range and mobility let him attack and retreat at the same time, and he sustains pretty well, so he doesn't really lose against that many champions. Ironically, most of his counters are actually melee, but even then, you can space your Qs well enough. A common misconception is that Fiora is a hard counter to Aatrox because she can parry all of his attacks and dodge his Q. Technically true, but she has terrible wave clear without Tiamat and gets outranged by Aatrox. Furthermore, though Fiora can parry his Q or W, she can only realistically block 1 out of 4 of them, the rest are fair game. And since Aatrox can dash at any point during his Q animation, he can sidestep her counterfire, making this matchup surprisingly winnable for him. Although she outscales him to hell and back in the late game, but I mean Fiora outscales everyone, so what can you do? Due to his repertoire, enemy top laners who are too predictable in their habits can find themselves taking a lot of damage, especially if the Aatrox player is good at mixing out their pressure. Let's say you're playing Renekton versus Aatrox. Since he has a dash, most inexperienced Renekton players will try to dodge his first or second Q by dashing up close. Aatrox can surprise his opponent by dashing backwards while using Q to match Renekton's dash, not only keeping himself just outside of Renekton's attack radius, but also blowing his dash, which has a longer cooldown than Aatrox's, thus allowing Aatrox to go on the offensive now that Renekton has no mobility. This kind of mix-up potential for him exists in every matchup top lane since he's one of the few champions in the game who can dash mid-ability cast. Basically, even losing matchups are winnable as he can decide the pace of laning phase. Overall, half of Aatrox's popularity stems from how safe of a champion he is in the most critical part of the game, the early game. Very few top laners are a hard losing matchup for him besides Irelia and maybe Pantheon, emphasis on maybe. So you have a safe, blind pickable lane bully who can pressure lane very comfortably, ensuring that he either wins lane or goes even. That makes him a very consistent champion, and consistency has a ton of influence on a champion's popularity. One more thing is the satisfaction of mastery. When trying him out for the first time, players may find his rather slow Q animation to be uncomfortable alongside mastering the timing on his dashes or repositioning. Then again, those clunky animations also make it all the more gratifying when you land those hits, particularly the final one. Aatrox is very easy to understand and his mechanics are not that complex, but there still is a learning curve to him since you have to understand how to space correctly, something melee top mains are not used to since we're usually always up in our opponent's faces. It's ironic that someone who can miss all of his abilities and therefore fluctuate wildly in damage is one of the most consistent champions in top lane, but most of that fluctuation has nothing to do with him. There is a clear sense of skill expression and reward as you progressively improve that skill because Aatrox is a very fundamentals-oriented juggernaut. His performance is directly tied to how well the player understands the ebb and flow of a game, when to use Q to harass, when to approach aggressively, when to bait an enemy approach. In a way, all of Aatrox's matchups are skill matchups that are ever so slightly in favor of either him or his opponent. You don't really see that in this game, especially not in top lane. A gold Mordekaiser can destroy a challenger Malphite. That matchup is so free. On the subject of satisfaction, what affects player satisfaction for better or worse is agency, the feeling that you have control over the outcome of something. Juggernauts are extremely volatile in this regard. There are some games where they feel like the most invincible force of destiny the world has ever laid eyes on, and in other games they feel like a glorified cannon minion depending on what the enemy team comp is. Aatrox's combination of range, sustain, damage, and mobility makes him surprisingly consistent in the mid-game even if the enemy team consists of champions who can theoretically dodge his Qs. For one, he has enough distance coverage and lockdown to destroy most AD carries and mages. He has the durability and power to match any other top or jungle with a half-decent mid-game. And to top it off, he has a very strong 2-item power spike, or in other words, a very strong mid-game. In a way, Aatrox is sort of the modern day version of Renekton. Renekton used to be famous for being a very safe top laner for much of the same reasons as Aatrox. Or rather I should say, Aatrox derives a lot of the same reasons as Renekton. Both are simple to understand, both have zero cost abilities, both have very consistent sustain, at least until they got Renektons. Both are lane bullies, both have incredible 2-item power spikes, and both have the same weakness of falling off late game. The durability update and Preseason 13 have slowed the game down a great deal to give late game champions more consistency in reaching late game. The result is a shift in focus from early and mid game to mid and late game, a change in dynamic that actually works in his favor. Unlike other lane bullies who either win really hard or lose really hard, like I mentioned before, Aatrox has the option to play safe if you don't feel confident in winning the 1v1 or if you're being weak-sided, meaning he can reach his 2-item power spike without resorting to feast or famine in the mid game, therefore having a chance to shine. Regarding power spikes, every champion reaches their supposed full capacity upon acquiring a certain number of items. The easiest example of this is the Marksman class. Not counting boots, most AD carries require 3 completed items in order to activate Infinity Edge's crit damage bonus. It differs between champions, but the majority of the roster becomes fully functional by 2 or 3. Obviously the earlier, the better. Why do you think people joke about how Irelia reaches full build off of Vam Scepter or Camille starting to one-shot people with just Divine Sunderer? Being a physical damage caster, Aatrox has a 2-item power spike, and fortunately he was one of the greatest beneficiaries of the Mythic item system. Prior to Season 11, AD Bruisers were in a weird spot. Their only first item choices were Black Cleaver and Triforce, neither of which were all that efficient on Aatrox since he didn't deal enough separate instances of damage fast enough to stack a Black Cleaver and his attack speed is kind of average. Gordranger and Eclipse were excellent for him, and that goes for all the other items like Death's Dance, Serotha's Grudge, Maudma Mortius, and so on. Serotha's finally gave a Rylai's equivalent for physical damage dealers, and Aatrox can't get enough of this item. The lack of % health damage or innate armor shredding in his kit causes him trouble against tanks, and sometimes having that extra slow makes landing subsequent Qs easier for him. Death's Dance's healing and Moss Shield both scale off of bonus AD. With his ultimate giving a temporary death cap passive, he gets a ton of healing and shielding value. Also, lest we forget, the damage delay on Death's Dance buys him time to drain tank his way through any burst. He's definitely gotten a lot of interact buffs from items over the past few years. Now what's interesting is that unlike other popular champions who are usually either extremely hated by the community or are frequently nerfed, no one really has a bad opinion about Aatrox. He's a very fair champion with discernible pros and cons. Just as there are moments where he feels completely unstoppable, there are an equal number of moments where he feels completely worthless. Another thing is that the only times he really feels broken quote unquote is when he's massively fed. Otherwise, he's pretty reasonable. Thing is, a positive reception from the player base has a lot to do with champion's popularity. Top lane in particular has a very strange dynamic. As a top lane myself, I can attest to this, but many of us have this sense of pride and dignity about the champions we play. Most top laners respect bruiser and tank mains because they don't resort to any cheese or BS to win, just a straightforward laning phase. Meanwhile, there's an unconscious prejudice towards anyone who plays cheese top laners like Akshan, Teemo, Kennen, Vladimir, Vayne, Heimerdinger, you know, that kind of stuff. Aatrox may bear similarities to ranged top laners by virtue of his neutral game, but he still feels like one of those quote-unquote honorable top laners. That may sound weird considering he has the second highest ban rate right now, but he doesn't carry the same reputation as the more infamous champions up top. Everyone has at least one champion they refuse to play on general principle. For me, I refuse to play Riven no matter how broken she is, it's just not happening. But I've never seen anyone who doesn't click with Aatrox. It's like a feedback loop. He's a safe blind pick, therefore people want to try him out. He's fun to play, incentivizing players to use him, and the need to use him is reinforced by how safe he is to blind pick, ultimately making him very popular. At times he may be a bit overtuned, but he's very fair, very safe, and very consistent. These days, traits like that are in short supply. So what are your thoughts on Aatrox? Do you agree or disagree with my points? Feel free to share in the comments down below. That's going to be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out the channel. Also consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other Why Everyone Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.